Before we got super excited about what ChatGPT, LLMs, and neural networks would do, I've always been intrigued by the insights that we could get from data analysts. Now, this career has been in high demand and it's expected to grow by 33% in 2031. So today I'm speaking with Jess Ramos, a senior data analyst whose journey includes mastering both mathematics and business analytics. She's played a pivotal role in helping thousands of others break down barriers to get into the field. So, can you talk a little bit about your journey, what got you into this field, and what's the coolest thing about being a data analyst?
Yeah, so my journey started in undergrad. I took info systems, and to be honest, I was just looking for an easy A. I needed a business elective. So I took the class and I started learning about data in that class. I learned about the basics of data analytics, a little bit of Tableau, some R, and that was really my first exposure to data analytics. And from there, I got a job on campus. And through there, I learned a lot about data cleaning and R, a little bit about machine learning, and that was where I really fell in love with data. So I decided to go to grad school and I got my master's in business analytics. And then from there, I interned at this local fintech company as a data analyst. And then I worked my way up through senior data analyst, data analytics manager, changed jobs a couple of times, and now I'm a senior data analyst at Crunchbase.
That's pretty cool. I've heard a lot of people that are super performers really talk about how important their internship was. Do you have any insight into what you hear from people about getting an internship when you're in school?
Totally. I think getting an internship is super important to just get some experience before you get to your real full time experience. And I think it actually helps you get a better job in some cases. It's a little easier to get a job. And then I think it helps you be a little more choosy when you have some experience to stand on.
Yeah, and I think that developers were like the super cool job to have before. And I feel like data analysts are kind of taking over that role. Like it feels that because we have AI now, that job of data analyst has sort of gotten a lot of focus. Can you talk about what makes being a data analyst especially cool and different?
Yeah. So I think it's in the middle ground between technical and then your soft skills. So you get to do the fun technical coding stuff, the challenging stuff, and then you also get to do like the working with stakeholders, being really integrated into the business. So I think it just really marries like the technical and non-technical sides of data together. And I think that's why it's so challenging. You can be the best coder in the world, but if you can't communicate and develop business insights, then you're not going to be a great data analyst because you really have to have both and be strong in both areas.
That's pretty awesome. So let's go ahead and kind of start with the basics of the job. I love the course that you did for LinkedIn Learning on data analysts, on getting a job in data analytics, which is kind of our main topic today. So, can you kind of define what data analysis is and what goes on sort of in a day to day for somebody in this position?
Yeah, so being a data analyst, you're an interpreter of data and you're also a translator of data. So you're picking up all these business questions from stakeholders, you're interpreting the results of or the questions of those and figuring out what data you need. And then you're going to the data, you're preparing the data, getting it ready for analysis, and then you're getting insights from the data. And then you have to translate all those insights back to stakeholders and into business recommendations. So you're really going from complicated and sometimes unclear stakeholder questions to the data and then back to the stakeholders. So you're really that middleman who has to interpret everything from both sides and then end up with business recommendations.
So that really does involve understanding a lot of maybe different things that developers don't necessarily get to, be involved with. So more like a deeper understanding of the business and also maybe a lot more communication. So it does involve, I guess, transforming. You mentioned a lot of transforming metadata into information that businesses can actually make decisions from. So can you give maybe some practical examples of how these businesses actually use a data analyst in their jobs to accomplish a specific task?
Yeah, so there's a huge spectrum there. There's the side of descriptive analytics, so you're telling what has happened in the business. So an example of that would be building dashboards, looking at trends, pulling out any sort of information from the past and telling stakeholders what has happened in the past. And then there's all the way to the side of predictive analytics or prescriptive analytics. So what should happen or what will happen in the business. So an example of that would be some product analytics. So doing A/B testing and experimentation, you're making recommendations of what should happen in the business. So there's a lot of different analytics roles out there, and some of them are more on the what has happened side, and then some of them are more on the what should happen or what will happen side.
So it's a really broad spectrum. And I guess mainly it's just helping like a decision makers like make their decisions with solid data. But what ends up happening sometimes, being in different companies, I can tell you that sometimes like the data analysts can't really provide hard answers. Like you can't really say this is definitely better than this. And so you mentioned in your course again that your job is sometimes also an art. There's an artistic sort of component to it, which I think is also what makes it interesting. So how do you navigate when people ask you like a tough specific, tell me what's better, and there isn't necessarily like a better answer?
Yeah, that's one of the toughest things I think to deal with in this type of role. And I think that's why ChatGPT and AI isn't going to fully replace us, because
Hmm.
sometimes you have all the data you have and you have to make a human decision based on the business, and you have to incorporate all these other, qualitative factors into the decision. I think some simple examples are handling outliers, handling null values. Do you recode them with null, zero, or the mean? So you're making all these decisions on the fly, and sometimes there's not a right or wrong answer. You just have to make the best answer, the best decision based on the information you have and what makes sense in the business context. And I've actually had experiences more, a little more complex than handling nulls. So sometimes in like product analytics, you don't always have a really definite answer. Maybe you ran an experiment and the results came back inconclusive. So you can look at a particular trend that was happening, but you maybe didn't have statistical significance. Nothing conclusive came back. So then from there, you have to make the next step, the next recommendation, and figure out, okay, do we iterate and do this again? Is there anything we can draw from this experiment? So you're always just making these decisions that really impact the business, but there isn't always a clear cut yes or no answer for some of them.
So do you ever find yourself sort of, I don't know, justifying the fact that you can't give like a yes or no? Do you end up going to like, I think we're, 80% sure of this, or, how do you kind of communicate that, I don't know, uncertainty factor that, comes from just showing people data? Because, you can't be wrong about data, or you can interpret the data wrong perhaps. So how do you deal with that?
I think the biggest thing is just being transparent and being really
Hmm.
careful with the verbiage that you use with stakeholders. So, for example, you don't want to imply causation if there isn't causation. So, if something is correlated and there's a trend, you have to be open about the fact that it's not causation. And back to the experiment example, I recently called an experiment that was inconclusive, and we decided that it wasn't something that we wanted to wait on forever to get statistical significance on. We said, okay, we've learned so much. We've learned X, Y, and Z from this experiment based on these other data points, that it no longer makes sense for us to wait for statistical significance, because we know the impact is pretty small at this point if we haven't gotten stat sig yet. So now we're iterating on V2 of the product. And that's something that's it's kind of hard to accept when you put all this work into something. Sometimes I want like this clear cut, pretty answer. I want to say that this was impacted X percent, or this amount. But sometimes you have to be okay with, we learned a lot from it, and this is the next step based on what we learned. So I think just verbalizing that with stakeholders and making sure that you're open about correlation versus causation. These are the assumptions. These are the limitations, and then also just being okay with saying we don't know, we don't have the data to support that sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that definitely good leaders understand that aspect of it. I think I don't know, people can misunderstand you or misunderstand the capabilities of data analysis. I know that I mentioned in the intro. I think that we work with data analysts when I worked at a newspaper, and they were like the most fantastic people because they can really get you so much more, so much information that is relevant to what you're trying to achieve. So it's a super cool. I've always had high admiration for data analysts, even before I knew that it was such a prevalent job. So I know that you talk in your course about how much you like math, but you know that some people are not maybe necessarily strongest in math. So what are some of the hard skills that a data analyst needs to be solid with? Does it involve math, statistics, logic? Do you need any programming? What sort of skills like that are hard do you need to make sure that you have before you pursue that job?
Yeah, and honestly, that was the toughest video in my course for me to write. I think I drafted it like 10 different times, and it was just really hard because I don't want to ever sound gatekeepy, because you really don't need to be a mathematician to work in data analytics. But at the same time, I don't want to just completely dismiss math, because when you're doing A/B testing or machine learning or even handling nulls, looking at distributions, it really is math. So I would say on the math side, you definitely need a good solid foundation of business statistics, and especially in the context of data. If you want to do more advanced analytics, you have to know A/B testing and hypothesis testing. And then, of course, a lot of programming is math. So the logic you're using, Boolean logic, even if you're just filtering like in SQL, you're filtering a certain column for this or this, that comes down to math. So math is an important part of analytics, but you don't have to go get a math degree or know super complicated abstract algebra or anything. I don't recommend taking that class. I just had PTSD thinking about it for a second there. As
Yes.
far as programming, I would say definitely like SQL. You don't have to know programming like on a Python level just to start out in analytics. You don't have to go build a bunch of machine learning models and a bunch of apps and stuff. That's not required, especially for the entry level data analytics side. But you do need to have a solid foundation of SQL and database management and understanding data models. That stuff is pretty essential no matter what type of role you're in.
So definitely, I mean, for people who want to get into this field, this is a technical field. This isn't like, I don't know, you like English or communicate, you have great communication skills. You definitely need to have sort of the hard sciences, the solid sciences. If you perhaps add a little bit of programming, Python would probably definitely be the thing. Even in the courses that you mentioned that I think you mentioned R, you mentioned some programming things as well as specific applications. So can you go over some of the kind of industry standard specific hard applications that people might want to learn about?
Yeah, so I'd say in SQL, definitely know how to interpret a data model, just understanding how different data sets are connected through different keys. That's really important, understanding different granularities between different data sets and how they're affected when they're joined. Speaking of joined, know how to join different data sets together in different ways. So using joins, maybe using unions, being able to aggregate data using aggregate functions and group by. And then if you want to get to the more advanced stuff, you can start learning CTEs and subqueries, window functions, just learning how to manipulate data in different ways, because a lot of what you're going to do is going to be in SQL. Even if you're in a job that's building dashboards and a BI tool, you're probably going to have to build your own data sets in SQL.
That's really exciting. I think that you made my head spin a little bit. I know enough SQL, I think, to be dangerous, not necessarily to be a data analyst. And so when you mentioned like joins, I remember doing like triple left joins and very complicated things, but nothing to the level that I think you need to be maybe more conceptual. And that brings me to the next point that I love that in the course you mentioned that you or somebody who like to work with metadata and that it takes a truly creative mind that enjoys a challenge. And I feel like that's the key thing. You can learn all the technical stuffs, you know, no matter how much of it you already have. The technical things are always, I don't know, for me, very mechanical things that if you put your mind to it, give it some time, you're going to get better and better at it. But there's an aspect of creativity and having the kind of person that enjoys a challenge that isn't kind of like I don't know doesn't gets frustrated when the data doesn't work out or they can be continuously trying to make things better. So what sort of soft skills do you think are really the key to thriving in this field?
Yeah, I think the big one you really were hinting at was problem solving. If you're the type of person who doesn't like to be challenged all the time, don't get a job in data analytics because every day you're solving new problems, things are breaking, you're putting out fires. It's a very exciting and rewarding field, but you're always having to solve problems, learn how to do things different ways. It's challenging, and that's what I like the most about it. Some of the other things you have to be good at on the soft skills side is communication. You're working with stakeholders all the time. You have to learn how to speak their language, so you have to understand the appropriate business acumen. So you have to learn how to talk to product managers and marketing people and engineers. You have to learn how to talk to all these people and speak their language and then figure out what that means in the data. So just being able to communicate between different teams is awesome. And what are some other soft skills?
I could really see why somebody, needs to. This is a very sort of, high value position because it really does take a lot of different things that don't normally come in a single package. Like, I always tell people if you're a developer, if you want to be a developer, the number one thing that you should have is, I don't know, the ability to not mind frustration because programming is mainly frustration with a few and a moments of joy when you figure something out. But most of the time, you're just getting frustrated. And like if you don't like that, then maybe that's not the thing for you. And I feel that the data analysis is that, but there's also these other components. You mentioned communications. You mentioned the ability to speak to developers and business leaders. And, that's not something that I think everybody has and everybody enjoys. You may be a developer. Developers like to kind of work with other developers, I think, and be kind of like left alone by themselves. They're not
Isolated. Yeah.
necessarily the most communicative people, so that does give me, I think, a good kind of understanding that, yeah, maybe that same kind of thing, the ability to overcome frustration because it's part of it. You mentioned messy data, like, you're never going to get perfect data, right? With something like analytics. And you're also going to, there's some things that are just, you have to kind of work through. So, but in that case, though, is it then possible to become a data analyst without a traditional education? Is there a lot of people that just learned it themselves?
Absolutely. And I know tons of people who went that way and they're doing amazing. I went the quote, I guess, traditional route going to grad school, and I'm happy with my decision. I think grad school is a great option. I think it made sense for me and aligned with my goals and where I was in my life, but it's definitely not mandatory at all. I mean, really, you don't even need a bachelor's degree anymore. Like, it helps, but you don't even need one anymore as long as you learn the right skills. And when I say learn the right skills, I'm not talking about one of these boot camps that says you can get a job in 30 days if you learn a little SQL and Tableau. Like, that's not what I really mean here. But if you take the time and you set aside, I don't even want to put a number on it, but 6 months or so, and you work on it every day for 6 months, you can absolutely build up your skills and get an amazing job in data analytics. It really comes down to learning the right skills, learning how to build a really good portfolio that's going to help you stand out, and then, probably most importantly, learning how to communicate those skills in interviews and show that I am a data analyst. I'm not a teacher transitioning into analytics or, uh, an Amazon truck driver transitioning into analytics. I am
Right.
a data analyst. So, learning how to present yourself that way in interviews and being confident in your skills is what's most important.
So have you seen like any patterns of like the type of people that maybe came from different sorts of, jobs before or different kind of had some different skill sets that are kind of an easy transition into like a data analyst job?
Um, I think as far as patterns, it's the people who are most passionate about it. There's a
Hmm.
lot of people in my network who have no college education. They don't have any sort of corporate experience, even, but they're learning every day. They're putting in the time, they're putting in the effort. And I know when they get on the job market, they're going to be more dangerous than people who are overly confident in themselves because they've been working at their skills. And it really comes down to the skills, it comes down to the SQL and the portfolio, but it really doesn't matter what domain you come from. It's how you leverage your previous background and connect the dots from that to where you want to go in your interviews.
So one thing I heard from you that I wasn't expecting is that you mentioned the concept of having a good portfolio. And, this is something that I heard a little bit from Nick Singh, who was here on the show a couple of weeks ago.
Hmm.
He mentioned that he built an application and that really opened the doors for him because he had something to show. So talk a little bit about that concept of what does a portfolio for a data analyst look like?
Yeah, so this is something I had to learn when I went looking for my second data analyst job because I was like, wow, I have all of this experience. I have almost 3 years experience, but I don't know how to get interviews. I don't know why I'm not getting interviews. So a portfolio, you can host it wherever you want. I recommend GitHub because it's the most widely used. So you want to put all of your projects in there and you want to make sure you're showcasing all your different skills. So maybe a few different SQL projects, whatever covers all your basic SQL skills. I say basic, but basic to intermediate, whatever's going to help you stand out. Maybe a few dashboards in Tableau, Power BI. You want to show that you have like the coding skills and the data wrangling skills. And then you also want to show that you have the dashboard and storytelling skills. And then probably the most important part is you don't want to just throw all of your code and stuff into GitHub and just leave it. You want to have a good README file because a lot of managers aren't going to go looking through all your code. So your README file is just explaining what is in this folder, what's in all your files. So you want to start out with like a business problem. What problem are you trying to solve? What methodology did you use? How did you solve the problem? And then this is where I really like to stand out. Don't look at my GitHub right now, but when I do take home assignments with companies, I like to stand out by going really heavy on the business recommendations, limitations, and next steps, because
Mm.
that really shows that you're thinking through how this is going to impact the business. You're also recognizing the limitations of the project, and then you're making next steps. You're coming up with ideas for the future to iterate and continue on that project.
Yeah, I know that Nick had built this wrap application. It was a really interesting project. It was like a wrap stock, app. So I don't know if you've seen it, but basically he was, I can't now. I'm drawing a blank here, but he was letting people take a look at different rap artists and basically I guess gauge their value and have people sort of bet on the stock as if they bet on them as if they were stocks. And what I got from that basically was that what was brilliant about what he built was that it's something that had all these different hooks that people could latch onto from personal experience. So if he met somebody that loved rap music, he could talk to them about that. And he could really geek out on the data analysis if that's what they wanted to talk about. But there's all these ways that you can get the interviewee interested by having something that is different, but that it's topical and can kind of get you to talk together. So maybe you can talk about what, maybe you mentioned GitHub, but what have been perhaps some of the most effective portfolio type projects that you've seen that very specifically sort of touch on some topics that might get somebody excited.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Nick did, and I haven't seen it, I'm gonna have to go check it out. But I think what Nick did is he did something extremely memorable. How do you interview a candidate with a project like that and forget it? Like you can't. Like it's a very
That's
distinct
right.
and unique project. So I think that's awesome. Make yourself stand out. I think depending on what type of role you want to go into, make sure that your projects kind of align with that role. So don't use the Titanic data set, don't use the Iris data set. Like those are fine if it's like your first project and you want to follow along with a project online and learn. But take it to the next level. For your portfolio, do projects that are relevant to your industry. So I'm kind of in like the finance, like tech space. So some of my projects were based on mortgage data and loan data, finance kind of problems. If you want to go into, e-commerce, you could do like an Amazon data set or something like that. Try to find a project that's relevant to your industry because it'll show the hiring manager that you will fit in good on their team solving their industry's problems. I really like to do product analytics. So I think a good funnel analysis is always fun. Tracking customers through like a funnel and learning how to improve a product, make product decisions. That's a really cool project I've done in the past in the real world. And I actually have an example in my LinkedIn learning course coming out. I had to plug my LinkedIn learning course.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I really enjoyed watching pieces of it. So I know you have one course. I'm sure you're going to be doing some more. I'm super excited about all the content you're going to have. And I can tell you that it was really interesting to me, somebody who's comes from more of a development background. There's a lot of really cool stuff in there. So I appreciate you being here. Now, you made this really interesting post about how you made a mistake during your SQL coding interview. And what the interview mentioned was that she liked how you handled the problem. So I know there's probably a lot of nervousness happening, when people are going through that process. What can you sort of tell about that instance and how it helped you actually maybe rethink coding interviews or interviews for data analysts?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy you asked this question because I think it's something really important to talk about. This was my job search last October-ish. So like this was like fairly recently-ish, and I don't even remember what my mistake was. It was a pretty standard SQL live coding, and I don't remember what my mistake even was. It was so insignificant to the whole problem. But I remember my interviewer kind of pointed it out, like, wait, aren't you forgetting something? And I remember I was like, oh yeah, this needs to be here because XYZ. If I don't include it, this will happen. And I kind of like explained why real quick. So when I was getting feedback from my manager right before I got my offer, she was like, these are all the notes I had from all your interviewers. And she actually pointed out that I made a mistake, but she liked that she got great feedback from the interviewer, that I fixed the mistake quickly, and then I explained why it was incorrect that way. So I think that really taught me that doing a live coding is such a good opportunity to see how a manager or how your teammates would react to you making mistakes. And I think people think they have to be perfect in a live coding and do it perfectly. I'm not. Like, I just wrote a SQL course with LinkedIn Learning, and I still make mistakes in SQL all the time. It's just part of it. Like, you're always going to make mistakes, but it's about how you recover from them and move forward that's important.
Yeah, I think like if you make it to a live interview, you are beyond the point where they're looking at necessarily your qualifications and they want to see a few of the more soft skills and how you deal with issues. You know, Understanding that nobody's perfect, seeing how you react to something interesting like an error, it's actually going to tell you more about the person than anything else on their resume. Everybody's perfect on their resumes. Every maybe portfolio looks great. So what happens when somebody makes a mistake? You find out more about a person, I think, maybe when the chips are down. So one thing that I definitely wanted to cover was all of the stuff happening with AI. So last week, or I think a few days ago, ChatGPT added this feature that I don't know if you've seen called the code interpreter. So this is basically a chat GPT plugin that allows you to upload data directly into ChatGPT. And it actually writes Python for you by you prompting it with simple English questions. So this is pretty interesting. What impact do you think something like AI will have in data analysts' jobs?
Yeah, I think it definitely raises a lot of questions. One thing that you just said, and I haven't seen this product yet, but one thing you said that stood out to me is uploading data into ChatGPT.
Yeah,
That
pretty
raises
interesting.
yeah, that raises some security questions, maybe some ethical questions, especially for people that are dealing with, personal private data. Um, I think AI is a tool that can help us do our jobs, but it's not going to replace us. It might replace like super basic entry level, maybe data entry positions, but I don't think it's going to replace very many positions at all, because it's going to create more positions, first of all, because people have to make and maintain the AI tools. But again, like, it comes down to soft skills. I mean, you have to be able to talk to stakeholders. You have to understand the business problem. You have to know the business acumen. You have to make trade-offs. Sometimes, there's not a right or wrong answer. You have to make the best decision based on the information you have. And AI just can't do those things. So I'm happy to use AI to assist me in my job, but it's kind of like using Google Translate to translate your Spanish homework. Like, it sounds a little funny. Your teacher knows that you probably didn't write it yourself. It's the same situation. And I see that stuff on LinkedIn. I see people use AI tools to write comments on my post, and they're talking about Christmas in the comments. And I'm like,
What?
what? Yeah, like it just makes no sense.
Yeah.
So I think that part is interesting. And then another question I think that kind of raises is that if stakeholders and non-technical people have access to these tools, it could be a little dangerous if they're getting this code and writing their own SQL queries. They might not know the nuances of this table. They might not understand that this table has this under the hood because it's built off of a view. So I think as much as it's great to help democratize data, I think it's also good to keep the analysts and the technical people in the picture because they understand the intricacies of the data.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's definitely going to be instances where something like ChatGPT can help, but as you mentioned, it can create some major problems. We saw some of those things, recently. One of the things that happened with Samsung was that developers were actually having ChatGPT help them with the code, and they pasted some of the proprietary code from Samsung, and people were able to find them. That's definitely not good. Another incident happened when a lawyer decided to do some research on cases for the current case that he was dealing with. And so he had ChatGPT write up, basically a summary for him. And he used it in the case that he was working on. When it came to the judge realized there's a lot of stuff in here that I've never heard of before. I've never heard of any of these cases. He looked them up, and sure enough, one of the issues with ChatGPT is that it hallucinates and it just makes things up all the time. So you really do have to be careful. I do think that with the plugins and this particular plugin, it is better when you give it information to be focused on, and it's also pretty interesting that when you ask it questions about, say, an Excel spreadsheet or a PDF or a CSV or whatever, it can write code for you that accomplishes certain tasks. And you
Mhm.
can see, it'll actually write tests to make sure that that data is fine. So I think there's, a way in which these tools are going to be useful. Right now, there's a lot of caveats. You mentioned privacy. Like, all right, you're uploading your Excel spreadsheet to ChatGPT. More than likely, right now, that yes, and that's really dangerous. Like, unless there are some sort of protective bumpers against that, then that's not necessarily going to be something that you want to do. And you also touched on an issue that I think is really key. ChatGPT isn't good at doing people's jobs. It's good at creative tasks. It's good sometimes at summarizing, but it's not good for research. And so I think that in your field, I don't see how or if a lot of data analysts are using it right now. You probably know more about that than I do.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are using it. I think it's good as a starting point, like just to look up quick things or even, write me a query that aggregates orders by customer and month, just to see like a starting point. And then you can kind of see, oh, this is how you do it. They did, this method, they used a CTE, the date trunc function, whatever, and then you can go use that in your work. So I think it's good as like brainstorming, but I would be extremely hesitant to copy and paste from AI without knowing what it's actually doing because it doesn't really know how to apply, it's, I almost said its brain, but it doesn't have a brain. It doesn't know how to apply its knowledge to your work because it doesn't know your work the way you do. So it can be hard to even type in the right question to get out what you want.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't understand what questions to ask, which is really, to me, the job of a data analyst is to understand the business needs and know how to write the proper questions and then understand how to take that data and use it in a way that is going to be meaningful. It doesn't know any of that. The more you use ChatGPT, the more you realize its limitations. But I do think that there's some pretty exciting things. You mentioned, making writing SQL queries faster. I could totally see where it could do something like that. Because what it's really good for is having conversations about information. So if you said, I need to do a SQL query, and then you define the SQL query that does this, and this, and this, and this, and you can continue to have a conversation about it. Now I want you to look at this table. So it's so good for brainstorming, so good for trying out different things. Another feature of this particular plugin is the ability to chart out results. So when you do, say, a query, it can actually write you a program that processes the data, maybe cleans it up, but then it can also, right from the program, immediately do graphs and charts for you, and then you can export those out. So a lot of cool stuff is happening there. I think in the future, it's just going to make us more efficient and faster, and kind
Hmm.
of like, I don't know, maybe make something like cleaning up data a little bit more automated. But I don't think it's going to replace anyone anytime soon.
I don't think so either. And I literally have people on TikTok say this stuff to me all the time. They're like, AI is going to replace you. I'm like, no, it's not.
So
Like, I
no,
promise you, AI cannot manage all these stakeholders because I can barely manage them.
I always say, listen, we haven't even gotten rid of paper yet, and that was going to go away like 30 years ago.
It's true.
I think we're okay. We're going to be fine. And all the things that we thought that were going to go away. So next week I'm talking to Danny Ma. He works with media companies. I came from every media company that was going to be destroyed by every media company that came after it. So I worked in newspapers. When radio came out, oh, we were not going to need newspapers anymore. This is like in media. And then, movies came out, so that was going to replace things. Television was going to replace things. Internet was going to replace everything. And what we ended up getting is, our ability to now do things like a live stream is basically like what we used to think of having a TV show. Everybody can have a TV show now. Everybody can have their own podcast, which is like a radio show. Everybody can have their own blog. So everybody can have their own kind of mini newspaper. And that I think that what these tools are going to end up doing is essentially giving us more abilities to do things faster and more efficiently. That's where I see it. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that it would be kind of ignorant to say that it's not useful because it definitely is sometimes. So I think it should be our best friend in the data world. We should use ChatGPT and use it to make our jobs a little easier and a little more efficient, but not just take everything as truth from it and not solely rely on it.
Yeah, everyone, please be careful. It's very early and it's very dangerous. You don't
Yes.
want to be like that lawyer. Hopefully, he'll be fine. I'm sure he learned a lesson. I'm sure all the people at Samsung also learned good lessons from using it. And it's going to be great, but be careful with what you're doing. So thank you so much for coming to the episode. I really appreciate your time. I know you're super busy. So I do want to mention a couple of places where you can learn more about this future in tech. We have a LinkedIn page where you can subscribe to and be notified of updates and news and any changes. There's also a newsletter that has show notes. So basically, after we meet, I'll go ahead and create a newsletter post that'll have the video of the show notes, any of the links that we talked about. I usually add some additional links. There's also a YouTube playlist, and there's even a way to listen through an audio podcast. And next time, we're going to have Priya Rajani Mohan, a management consultant at KPMG. We're going to talk about the realities of implementing artificial intelligence. So, sort of continuing the conversation that we had here at the end into next week. And, we probably talked a little bit about it, but when is it not the right time to implement AI? I'm sure we'll have a lot of super cool insight. And again, thank you so much, Jess, for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Super cool. Talk to you later.